Well, hey friends, it is great to have you join us today, no matter where you're at. My name is Clay Munkus, and I'm the lead pastor here at Next Level, and I am thrilled to be back with you after a couple of weeks off here again this week. And we are in the third part of a series called Starting Point. And the premise for this entire series is simply this, that just like everything in your life has a starting point, faith has a starting point too. We probably don't think about it much, but somewhere along the way, somebody prayed for you or shared the message of Jesus with you or invited you to attend a church with them. And maybe you were brand new to faith, or you had walked away from faith for whatever your reasons were, or maybe you just didn't walk away on purpose. Maybe faith just seemed to slip away as the speed of your life increased. And now the faith you were just handed as a child doesn't seem to hold up under kind of the adult pressures that you find yourself in. So what we're doing in this series is asking, what would it look like to start all over with faith as an adult, to have an adult starting point for faith? What would that look like? Just to wipe the slate clean and just start our faith or restart our faith all over. And if we did that, what would be the questions that we would ask? So today, I want to start with something you probably haven't thought much about, maybe not even at all. I think we all understand that we had a starting point, right? A day that we were born. We all have birthdays. And we might have thought that our faith had a starting point. But have you ever thought about the idea that the whole story of faith has a starting point? Like the whole story about faith and all the things that we put into faith has a starting point. Every major faith tradition or a spinoff of a faith tradition has a story behind it. It has some history. It has a point at which it began. And I understand that we don't think that much about it if we think about it at all. There's not much interest in where faith comes from and who started it, because what we really want answers to is, God, I've been asking for a new job or a raise, or God, my wife needs healing, or my child needs you, or I've got a big test coming up next week and I need to pass that. What we really want to know is, God, are you there when I need you? I really don't have time for a history lesson, but what if part of the reason that we drift from our faith is not knowing our foundation? So today we're going to look at some history. And I want to look at something that each of us has struggled with in our faith, and I'm going to tie that to something that happened a really, really, really long time ago. And I hope this is really helpful for you as you are rebuilding or starting to build your faith as an adult. And the point in history I want to go back to is a starting point that three of the largest faith traditions in the world share. And that starting point is found in the story of one man, and the man's name is Abraham, or at this time period, he's called Abram. And before Abraham, which we have some history, which includes how God created the world, and this is not a sermon on how God created, rather, let's just say that God created the world. And you should know that we, as Christians, don't believe that just because the book of Genesis says it. We believe that because it's what Jesus talked about, and it's what Jesus believed, so we just kind of go with what he said. And Christians, we're kind of crazy that way. We just believe that if a man, like we talked about back at Easter, can predict his own death, resurrection, and pull it off, we just kind of go with whatever he says, right? Okay? So again, just hang with me. God creates the world, and somewhere along the way, humans mess it up. And as we talked about last week, sin works its way through the world, and things get really messed up. Then along comes this man named Abram, or later becomes Abraham. And it's with this man in his life that God chooses to step in and begin to undo and correct the problems that sin and mankind have brought into his creation. Now, even if you are still not sure that the Bible is true, and I get if you don't, this is really important because the conversations that are recorded between God and Abraham touch on a tension that you have felt. And they hit on something that you are feeling even today as you wrestle with faith and you wrestle with this faith that you were handed as a child. And the tension point is this. All of us, I believe this, all of us at some point, all of us seem to ask questions like this. If there is a God, Where do I stand with God? Right? Does God hear my prayers? Does God even care? And can I ever know there is a God? These are questions that I believe we all eventually ask. We want to know, can I ever have peace? Can I ever have security about the future? How do I know where I stand? If there is a God, how do I know where I stand with this God? And in this conversation that we're going to look at, there's a single statement that is so perplexing and so powerful. I want to leave it with you, and I want you to wrestle with it as you think about restarting or rebuilding your faith. And to get there, I want to tell you a story from my own life. Back in 1990, I was a third-year architecture student at Georgia Tech. And if you don't know much about architecture, all the programs are basically the same. They're all designed to not only teach you how to design buildings, they do that, but they're also designed to bring you to your absolute breaking point. It really is one of the toughest courses of study, at least in undergraduate work. Anyway, at this point in my academic career, I was living 3 nights a week in the studio, and I would sleep overnight on a makeshift bed that I had made under my drawing table in my cubicle. So at this point, for 2 years, I would go to class all day, work on homework all afternoon, and then go deliver pizzas for a couple hours, return to my drafting table and work on drawings till 3 or 4 a.m., fall asleep under my table, and wake up the next morning to rinse and repeat the whole process over again. Now, I wasn't the only person who lived like this. We all did. And there were about 30 other students in my studio who lived in their cubicles just like I did. And there was a lot of pressure to keep up. Because the way the program worked was this: if you missed any class or dropped a class or failed or took it incomplete, you would be dropped from the program until you could retake that studio class the next year. So again, a lot of pressure to stay awake, keep up, keep producing, even if your body could not keep up. So we all basically lived on Jolt Cola. Anybody remember Jolt Cola? Right? Large amounts of coffee and NoDoz, which is a massive caffeine boost. Basically anything that could keep you alert and productive till 3, 4, 5 a.m., 3 to 4 days a week, we used it, right? You get the idea. Now, one week we were working on our final project for the quarter, and we had been up for a couple of days straight, literally, and it was around midnight, and I was working in my cube, and I heard one of my classmates, his name's John, scream out some words out loud that basically I can't even repeat here what he screamed. Basically, a mistake had happened, and we heard, right? So several of us rushed over to see what had happened. Now, back in 1990, drawing was still done largely by using ink and pens on Mylar paper. And to get the ink down to the tip of the pen, if it had been a while since you used it, you would have to shake the pen, right? And one of the very first things that they taught you about these pens is they spit out a blob of ink if you're not careful. So you were never supposed to shake the pen over your drawing. You would always shake it to the side or somewhere else away from your drawing. But with all of the sleep deprivation that we were under, John had missed that step, and he had shaken his pen over his final drawing. And so when we arrived at his cube, there it was, a colossal ink blot right in the middle of the Mylar. And there sat John, shocked. And before any of us could say anything, John just said, "It's okay, guys. I'm just going to suck it up." And before we could stop him, he leaned down, stuck his face in the ink, and began to suck ink off the page. It was an absolute disaster. And in the shock of the moment, we could have just said, well, serves you right for doing something so stupid. I mean, they told you about that way back in our freshman classes. You should have been more careful, and then just walk back to our cubes to work on our projects, thinking, well, sucks to be you, John. Now, here's the thing. Some of you think that's what God is like. Some of you feel that God looks at the mess that you have made, the mess that you created, and the consequences of your own decisions and says, well, sucks to be you. You just figure it out, right? I'll be here if you need me. Call me when you get this mess cleaned up. And that's how you think God is. And for those of you who think that, you also probably don't think that even for a minute that I left my friend there face down in a pile of ink, which means you believe that I have more compassion than God, which makes me more godly than God. And trust me, that is not true. It means perhaps that there's something about God that you don't know. And if you're wondering, me and some other classmates around me, we did what any friend would do. We moved him back from the table and turned our attention to the drawings. Now, have you ever spilt paint and tried to clean it up? Right? It's a mess. You ever had a mess so big you don't even know where to start? This was a mess of epic proportions, and we didn't even know where to begin to clean it up. And in a similar way, during the time of Abraham, humans had made a royal mess of the world. Living in the world we live today, we can't even imagine the injustices that the ancient world, where there was no law, there were no civil rights, no civil society. It was survival of the fittest. It was a world of brutality. That was normal, where kidnapping was commonplace. And if you wanted someone, you just took them, where there was no city-states, no nation-states in the way that we think of them now. And in the midst of that very chaotic world, a world that would be repulsive to us today and our standards today, God sees the same thing even we would see today, that sin had taken hold of humanity. And if he was a God who cared, he had a decision to make. Do I wade into the mess and try to find a starting point for cleaning up this mess that someone else has created? Or do I just hang a big out of order sign over the earth and go do something somewhere else? And what we have in the story of Abraham is God choosing a starting point to wade into the mess of humanity. And the interesting thing about Abraham is that he was just a regular guy who had some real issues, right? Like in the very beginning of his story, as you're beginning to read and hear about Abraham, he's traveling through Egypt with his wife Sarah. And when some of Pharaoh's servants see Sarah, they tell Pharaoh how beautiful she was. And Pharaoh says, I want her, go get her for me. So they asked Abraham, they come up to him, they say, hey, is this your wife? And Abraham, he kind of sees what's coming, and he thinks, if they know I'm married to her, they're just going to kill me and take my wife. So Abraham, being the very courageous man of God, said, no, she's not really my wife. She's more like a sister. You can have her, right? Seriously, read the story. And he gave his wife to Pharaoh. Now, some of you may think you have loyalty problems in your marriage. Imagine that one. That's Abraham, right? The hero of the story. And you can read the rest of the story for yourself. He had all kinds of problems. He had all kinds of issues. But God, he had to start somewhere. So God picks this very imperfect person, Abraham. And this is way later, the story we're going to look at, way later in his life. Both he and Sarah, they get back together, are getting old. And he says to him in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, the Lord said to Abram, leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. In other words, I want you to abandon. I want you to leave your whole circle of influence. And I realize that you don't have any kids. And I realize that both of you guys are getting old now, right? I can see that. But Abraham, I'm starting over. I want you to know I'm doing a new thing. I'm starting something that's ultimately going to impact the whole world, and I've chosen you. And don't ask me why. I just had to start somewhere. And then he made Abraham, these are three very interesting promises, starting in verse 2. First promise he makes, he says, I will make you into a great nation. And that came true. The nation of Israel says, hey, we're that great nation. And in all of the Arab nations, they say, no, we are those great nations. And there's an argument over which great nations were referred to here, but there's one thing nobody argues over. Many nations came from the man Abraham. This promise by God to Abraham made 4,000 years ago absolutely came true. So God has a problem on his hands. And he picks a man and he says, one day, someday, you're going to be a nation. Actually, there's going to be nations upon nations. And through that nation, I'm going to do something significant in the world. Now, that's the first promise. Promise number 2, also in that same verse. I'm going to make you a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous. Now, to prove this point, I'm just going to do a really quick survey. So, Abraham, all right? How many of you would say that you have heard of Abraham before this message today, right? I mean, raise your hand. Yes. That's probably everybody who's watching, everybody who's listening to us right now, right? Now, how about this guy? Chedorlaomer. Chedorlaomer. How many heard of him, right? Probably not many. He was actually a famous king. He was the king of Elam, a country so great that it doesn't exist anymore. But everybody in that day, in the time of Abraham, they would have known who Chedorlaomer was, but they wouldn't have known Abraham. So God says to a nobody, I'm going to make you famous. And here we are 4,000 years later, halfway around the world, in a different language, in a different culture, and just about everybody that I could speak to knows who Abraham is. Third promise, Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. And all the families on earth will be blessed through you. Going to be blessed through you. And here we are 4,000 years later, and all the Arab nations are better off because of Abraham. All the Jewish people have been blessed because of Abraham. And all of the Christians and all of the people who have been blessed by Christians and orphanages and Christian hospitals and all of the people that have been touched by Christianity are better off because of Abraham. To which I think God would say, well, that was my point. That all of these families of earth would be blessed through you. And so God gives Abraham this promise. But there is a problem for Abraham. He knows he's an old man. And not only does he know that, on top of that, he doesn't have any children, right? So God tells him this, and then a lot more time passes. Abraham gets even older, and we get to Genesis chapter 15, and God returns to Abraham, reminds him of his promise to make his name great. And at this point in time, Abraham begins to point out the obvious to God. He begins to almost complain that he doesn't have any children yet. And in this conversation with God, he mentions that if he dies, all of his inheritance, everything that he owns, goes to Eliezer. Right? Another guy you probably haven't heard of. Eliezer was his chief servant. And everything, since he didn't have children, was going to go to Eliezer. So he's kind of complaining to God. Okay, God, you kind of promised that you're going to make me a nation. I don't even know what a nation is, but that sounds big. And God, you said everybody on the earth is going to know my name. And right now, I think there's probably 5 people, 10 people, 12 people who actually know who I am. And God, you said everybody's going to be blessed through me. And God, I don't even have a son, right? I don't even care about being a nation. I just want to have a son. I don't want to leave everything to my servant, Eliezer. And so he's praying one night. And, kind of like many of us pray, kind of prayers of desperation. And here's what the writer of Genesis says that God says back to him. In Genesis, all right, go to chapter 15, verse 4, where he says, Then the Lord said to him, No, your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son of your own who will be your heir. Then the Lord took Abram outside and said to him, Look up in the sky and count the stars if you can. That's how many descendants you will have. So basically God says, look, I know you don't have a son. I know you don't have an heir, but Abraham, I want you to trust me with something that you're going to have a hard time. I know you're going to have a hard time trusting me with. You are going to become a great nation. There will be more people who come from you than you will ever know and that you'll ever be able to comprehend. More people than you could ever count. And then something amazing happens. And pay attention here, because this is the personal part for you and the personal part for me. The writer of Genesis makes a statement that is so powerful and so personal. And maybe you've heard this before, and maybe you've read this before, but more than likely, maybe, you missed the significance of this next statement. This next statement is so incredibly profound. The implications of this is for every single one of us, because in this statement that God is about to make, for the very first time in recorded history, God states the nature between the relationship between God and man. And if you've ever wondered, how can I relate to someone as big as God? or how can I know God? Or can anyone know God? How can I know where I stand with this invisible, silent God? If you've ever asked any questions like that, this next statement is so unbelievable and so unbelievably simple, it is too good to be true. This is like before Moses and the Ten Commandments, right? It's before the Jewish law. This is 2,600 years before Islam. This is 2,000 years before Jesus. So before any of that, God says to Abraham in verse 6, and Abraham believed the Lord. And what was it that Abraham believed? He believed and trusted what God had told him was true. He's believing and trusting that even though I have no children, I just believe I'm going to have descendants as plentiful and as many as the stars in the heavens, okay? God, I trust you. And in that moment, in that solitary single expression of faith, God makes this declarative statement about Abraham. So Abraham believed in the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith. And in that moment, God said to Abraham, I'm giving you the gift of a right standing with me. Hey, that little incident in Egypt, with your wife, and I know that was really embarrassing. I'm not going to hold that against you. Abraham, I accept you because you believed and trusted me. Wow. Another way of saying it is this. Trust in God resulted in a right standing with God. Trust in God resulted in a right standing with God. This is the first indication that a human being can have a right standing with God. And I want you to pay attention. How did it happen? Faith, trust. And here's the interesting thing. Years would go by, and the Jews would come along, and they would miss this. They would say, no. The way you have a right standing with God is by being Jewish. We are God's chosen people. We are God's called people. In fact, by the time Jesus showed up, a couple of thousand years later, the Jews said to Jesus, hey, we don't even need you. We are Abraham's sons. We are Abraham's daughters. That's all that counts. And if all of you Gentiles want to be right with God, you have to become Jewish. And we'll let you kind of be grafted in, and then you can be one of Abraham's sons and one of Abraham's daughters like us. And it's all about who you're related to if you want a right standing with God. And then about 30 seconds after Jesus left the earth, there were a group of Christians who started arguing about this very subject. And one group said, oh, well, they've got to become Jewish. These Gentiles got to become Jewish. And they got to keep the whole law of Moses. And another group said, well, they can't keep the law of Moses. They don't even know the law of Moses. And somebody said, I think you just have to believe. And then they said, well, I don't know, believing is just too difficult. And right on through the Reformation, the church has been split over this issue of how do you have a right standing with God? And how do you know when God says, you're approved? How do you know when God says, I love you, you are fine? How do you know when you've done enough, when you've believed enough? How can you know? Is it birth? Is it behavior? Is it belief? Is it a combination of these two or three things? But before all of that, 4,000 years ago, before any of those religions existed, before there was anyone who considered themselves Jewish or Muslim or Christian, God revealed to Abraham this little secret. And it's almost impossible to comprehend that the creator of everything would make the standard so simple. That God, who saw each of us in our own puddle of ink on mylar paper, in a mess of our own making, in our own disobedience, this all-powerful God, regardless of what we believe theologically, regardless of what we believe about sin, regardless of the messes that we have made for ourselves, and many of us, we've made some big messes, that very same God said, the key, the formula, the way you enter into a relationship with me where I call you righteous and approved, I call you a friend, is not through who you are related to. It It is not through your behavior. It's simple. It is trust. It is, will you trust me? It's, will you do what Abraham did? Will you simply say, it's hard to believe. It's almost impossible to believe, but I'm going to trust what you say is true and that you'll do what you promised to do. So here's the question, and here's what I want to leave you with. What if the starting point for a relationship with God is simply trust? What if a starting point with God is simply trust? What if what we saw with God at the very beginning, where God decided to wade into this blob of ink on paper, this giant mess in the world, and decided, well, I got to start somewhere. I'm going to pick one unrighteous man, and I'm going to connect with him in a personal way, and all I require is that he say, God, I trust you. Hey, guys, what if that's it? Now, I know this is hard. It's hard because of the way you have been raised. It's hard because of what you've heard from people like me standing on stage and preaching messages. It's hard because of what you heard in some religious service. It's hard because of what you read. It's hard because of what has been laid on you, because there's no other place in the world where you can be unconditionally loved and accepted simply based on trust. It didn't happen in school, right? It didn't happen on the sports field. It didn't happen at work. And for many of us, it didn't even happen in church. And yet, when we go back, pre-Christian, pre-Jewish, we find God saying to Abraham, I declare you righteous because you trusted me. What if the starting point for our relationship with God is as simple as trust? Now, here's what I want you to do. I'm going to give you a question, and I want you to kind of talk about this. So in your groups this week, or while you're riding in the car on your way home today, or while sitting at lunch today, I want you to answer this question. This is what I want you to do. And here's the question. As you begin to think about this, which of the following here best reflects your view and why? Right? God accepts me based on my birth. God accepts me based on my behavior. God accepts me based on what I believe, right? Which one of these beliefs that are here is it that you connect, right? Is it birth? Is it behavior, right? If I do the right things, then God accepts me. Or if I do the wrong things, then God doesn't accept me. Or does God just accept me based on what I believe? Or is it a combination of any of the above? All right, I want you to have that conversation. I don't want you to try to convince yourself of anything. I just want you to think about what it is that you really believe. I want you to think about it on an emotional level, right? It's easy for me to embrace the idea that maybe it's as simple or belief as trust. Is that easy? Or does it have to be something else? Which model did you grow up with? Which model feels more comfortable? Which model have you been intentionally or unintentionally leaning into? All right, I want you to talk about that. And then next week, we're going to come back and we're going to pick up the discussion right here. So let's pause and let me pray for you. Heavenly Father, we are so grateful for the preservation of this ancient text throughout the years. And if it really is true that our righteousness is achieved through faith alone, we ask that you give us the courage to consider and embrace this powerful idea. Help us to lean in this direction and open our hearts to this truth. God, I just thank you so much for what you have done in all of us. Many of us, we kind of grew up with kind of a Bible, and maybe it was on a coffee table or tucked away somewhere. Heavenly Father, I am so glad that you preserved this, and we know that what is true, that our standing with you comes through faith alone. God, give us the courage to lean into that, to embrace this very powerful idea. And I ask you take the words that I have spoken today and plant them into people's hearts. God, may they be reminded that they can always call out for you. regardless of their situation, regardless of what they've done. And God, grant us the wisdom to discern how to apply these truths to our lives and take action. We offer all this up in the name of Jesus. Amen. Well, hey, friends, thanks for joining us today. If you think today's message might be valuable to someone that you know, man, I would love it if you would just share this video. Not only could it be helpful for them, but by sharing this content, as well as liking and subscribing to this channel, you help us to accomplish our mission to raise the reputation of Jesus. And as I ask you every opportunity that I stand on the stage, I would really love it if you would head over to our website at nextlevelchurch.org. There's a big green button there. If you would click that green give button and choose one of the giving options that's there, I want you to know that your faithful support helps us get messages like this out to raise the reputation of Jesus where we live, work, and play. Now, by way of benediction, let me end with that last verse as it declares, and God makes this declarative statement about Abraham. Genesis 15:6 says, "And Abraham believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith." May you search your heart, and may you believe in the Lord. May you place your trust in him, and may you be called righteous because of your faith. Hey guys, have a blessed week. Talk about those questions, work on that, and we're going to pick that up next week. God bless you. We'll see you then.